He's not involved in the matchmaking. He's not involved in these contract negotiations. He's more of this face. But to hear him say it under oath in a court of law, I think that is significant.
Dana White just made a bombshell confession in federal court that nobody saw coming. He officially admitted he stepped away from running the UFC, revealing under oath that he no longer handles day-to-day operations. So, who's actually calling the shots now? And what does this seismic shift mean for the future of mixed martial arts? Here's what went down. On Wednesday, February 5th, 2026, White entered the U.S. District Court for the District of Nevada and spent over 2 hours on the witness stand. He appeared as part of two massive class-action antitrust lawsuits, Johnson v. Zuva and Sirkunov v. Zuva, both requiring his sworn testimony. The hearing, presided over by Judge Richard Bulwer-Tucken, was meant to address spoliation of evidence, specifically whether the UFC had illegally destroyed or misplaced text messages and phone records that executives were legally obligated to preserve. Since White discussed auto-delete features on his devices, mentioned a phone he claims was stolen in 2024, and even said he wants to return to using a flip phone once these legal battles conclude. But none of those technical details grabbed headlines. What shocked everyone was his candid admission about his actual job responsibilities. When lawyers pressed White about his involvement in negotiating fighter contracts, he stated his participation was absolutely less than zero. He declared that no manager on this planet could tell you he's negotiated a deal in years. Regarding matchmaking, the critical process of determining who fights whom on every UFC card, he said he doesn't really handle that anymore either. He explained that both responsibilities now belong to Hunter Campbell, the UFC's chief business officer, working alongside matchmakers Sean Shelby and Mick Maynard. He confirmed this arrangement has been in place since the UFC was sold to Endeavor in 2016, and the Fertitta brothers depart. MMA journalist Ariel Helwani responded to the testimony on his program, noting that none of this information was particularly surprising to industry insiders who'd been paying attention.
Anytime there's a contract dispute, anytime there's a big fight that needs to be made, is Dana aware? Is Dana involved from afar? Sure. Is he on the front lines? No. That's according to all the managers and fighters that I've spoken to over the past 10 years.
White provided concrete examples in court demonstrating just how disconnected he's become from operations. He referenced a last-minute contract dispute involving featherweight champion Ilia Topuria before a 2025 bout against Charles Oliveira, admitting he possessed limited knowledge of the specifics and deferred to Campbell's management of the situation. He also discussed text message exchanges with Conor McGregor, acknowledging he'd deleted them but explaining they were purely personal since he no longer handles any business negotiations. This represents how complete the separation has become. Even with one of the most recognizable names in UFC history, White maintains the business aspects are no longer his domain. Helwani quantified this shift precisely, stating that virtually none of the fights or contracts in the UFC are arranged by Dana White anymore.
He might come in at the very end to close a deal. He might be involved in a Conor McGregor fight, but 99% of the fights are not put together by him. 99.9% of the contracts are not put together by him. And this is not an indictment on him. I've been telling you this for a very long time. He used to refer to Hunter Campbell as like his lawyer. He's much more than that. He is, as I've said before, the most important person in this company because of how hands-on he is.
Judge Bulwer, meanwhile, remained focused on the missing evidence issues. He expressed doubt about White's explanations for deleted messages and suggested potential sanctions might be warranted. He highlighted inconsistencies in the UFC's evidence preservation protocols and indicated that the organization's device handling practices could be deemed sanctionable conduct. The hearing resumed the following day with testimony from Hunter Campbell and additional witnesses, but White's portion dominated discussions because the man who built the UFC just informed a federal judge he no longer performs the two most crucial functions in operating it. For numerous fans, this revelation immediately transformed how they view every current problem plaguing the UFC.
As fans of the UFC, we can no longer blame Dana White for the problems that the UFC is facing today. Dana White revealed in court yesterday that Hunter Campbell is the one negotiating fighter contracts, and he's also the one that is handling the UFC matchmaking. This just goes to show the obvious.
So if Dana White isn't making the fights or negotiating the contracts, who assumed control? When did this transition occur? And how did Hunter Campbell become the actual decision maker? The individual White repeatedly referenced in that courtroom was Hunter Campbell, not as an advisor or assistant, but as the person who genuinely manages the operational aspects of the UFC, including contracts, matchmaking, and the daily business of organizing fights. Campbell didn't accidentally fall into this position. He was strategically placed there at a pivotal moment in the promotion's evolution and has been quietly accumulating authority ever since. Campbell initially joined the UFC as a legal consultant before returning in 2017 in an enhanced capacity. This comeback wasn't coincidental, occurring immediately after the Fertitta brothers sold the UFC to Endeavor in 2016 and exited the company. Lorenzo Fertitta had been deeply embedded in business operations, contracts, matchmaking, and strategic decisions, so when he left, the UFC faced an operational vacuum. Dana White remained the public face and CEO, but the organization was evolving from a privately owned promotion into something far more corporate, requiring someone to manage the internal machinery. From his first week in the expanded role, Campbell was thrust into high-stakes fighter negotiations, establishing the framework for everything that followed. Helwani described precisely how Campbell was positioned from the beginning, brought in specifically to counterbalance White's public-facing responsibilities while operating behind the scenes.
And, the way it was described to me when he came on board after Lorenzo left, like he was going to be the yin to Dana's yang, and he was going to be the quote-unquote bad cop in that he's going to be the one, on the front lines doing these deals.
That phrase.
With the Fertitta brothers gone, this arrangement captures the entire dynamic perfectly. White evolved into the ambassador, the press conference personality, the individual who interfaces with media and appears on camera. Campbell became the person who actually answers the phone when a manager calls about financial matters. By 2019, Campbell received a promotion to Chief Business Officer, a title that formalized what had already been occurring in practice. Campbell's attention gravitates toward elite arrangements, including championship fights, pay-per-view headliners, and contracts involving substantial money and complex terms. Industry insiders emphasize that Campbell isn't merely another executive, he's been called the most important person in the entire organization.
And he essentially also said that Hunter Campbell is the man for that. And my take on that is, I told you so. I've been telling you this for a long time. Hunter Campbell is the straw that stirs this drink.
Campbell's testimony during the antitrust hearing, which occurred the day following White's appearance, revealed even more details. He discussed the UFC's unsuccessful pursuit of kickboxer Rico Verhoeven, the type of talent acquisition conversation that White would have personally led previously, but now falls entirely within Campbell's jurisdiction. He oversees interactions with athletic commissions worldwide, manages crisis situations like last-minute fight card modifications, negotiates contract extensions, and resolves disputes when conflicts arise between the promotion and its athletes. The scope of his duties has created a growing perception both inside and outside the sport that Campbell effectively operates the fight business side of the UFC. Before the 2016 sale, matchmaking was a collaborative effort involving White, Lorenzo Fertitta, Joe Silva, and Sean Shelby. After the sale, as the organization became more professional under Endeavor ownership, White began redirecting fighter inquiries and deal-making to Campbell's team, essentially removing himself from routine involvement by approximately. The roster now exceeds 700 athletes. The event calendar runs year-round, with roughly 45 events, and managing this complexity demands specialized expertise. Campbell's legal background provides him the tools to navigate contractual matters, while his strategic instincts shape matchmaking decisions. Helwani confirmed that managers and fighters have understood this reality for years, knowing it's Campbell, not White, on the other end of their call.
It's not Dana reaching out. It's not. Very few of the managers talk to Dana. We know about the ones who have, close personal relationships with him, but very, very, very few actually talk and negotiate to Dana.
One fan account summarized what this means for the current state of the product. If Campbell is running operations, then the frustrations fans experience with matchmaking and fighter compensation land on his desk, not White's.
Hunter Campbell is the one responsible for the low fighter pay, and he's also responsible for the awful UFC matchmaking lately. To me, I believe that I owe Dana White an apology because Hunter Campbell is the one responsible for running the UFC into the ground lately. I truly believe that if Dana White was still in charge of the UFC today, that the UFC would be in a much better place in regards to fan experience. Yes, I am glad that we can now watch the UFC on Paramount instead of having to pay $80 for a pay-per-view, but at what cost? The cards are very diluted these days, and that just stinks as a UFC fan.
Campbell's ascension didn't occur in isolation, but happened within a corporate restructuring that transformed who controls everything above the UFC. And this restructuring explains why White's role appears as it does today. In September 2023, the UFC ceased being an independent fight promotion, merging with WWE under a new publicly traded entity called TKO Group Holdings. Listed on the New York Stock Exchange, Endeavor Group Holdings maintained approximately 51% of TKO, while former WWE shareholders held the remaining 4%. The McMahon family's majority control over WWE ended, and the UFC became one division inside an expansive sports entertainment conglomerate, featuring corporate governance structures, board committees, quarterly earnings calls, and institutional investors monitoring every decision. The person at TKO's helm isn't Dana White, but Emanuel, who serves as executive chairman and CEO. Below Emanuel sits Mark Shapiro as president and chief operating officer, managing daily integration across TKO's expanding portfolio, which by 2025 included not just UFC and WWE, but also professional bull riders, On Location, and by early 2026, TKO Group encompasses approximately 33 significant subsidiaries operating across 8 countries. This is no longer a fight promotion managed by one individual and his partners, but a multi-billion-dollar corporation with multiple executive layers, compliance requirements, and fiduciary obligations to shareholders. Dana White sits on TKO's board of directors in a limited capacity tied to his UFC leadership, but he doesn't possess controlling voting power. He retained his CEO title for the UFC division, while Nick Khan operates WWE. On paper, this setup grants White considerable autonomy, but in practice, the corporate framework above him establishes boundaries, with decisions about media rights, revenue strategy, and expansion plans made within a structure where White represents one voice among many. A dramatic contrast to the era when he and the Fertitta brothers could make every decision independently. Additionally, there's the Meta board position. In January 2025, White was elected to Meta Platforms' board of directors, alongside John Elkann and Charlie Songhurst, receiving an initial stock package valued over $1 million. This role involves strategic oversight and advisory input for one of the world's largest technology companies, creating another set of obligations diverting his attention from the UFC. Then there's Power Slap, White's slap fighting promotion, launched in 2022 that has grown into a profitable venture, securing a television agreement with TBS, hosting events at the UFC Apex and Fontainebleau in Las Vegas, and landing sponsorship deals with companies like VChamp. A return to the Fontainebleau is scheduled for March 20. White addressed the Power Slap venture during the press conference following the New Year's Eve incident with his wife in January 2023, when a reporter questioned whether the timing would impact the new league.
It was incredibly unfortunate timing, I guess, in terms of the launch of a slap league. I mean, do you think that's going to impact what happens with that, or is it good to go? Or
there is no good or bad timing for what I did. You know what I mean? There's irony, very ironic, but there's no good or bad timing for what I did on New Year's Eve.
That same press conference demonstrated White's approach to personal crises: face the media, state his position, and move forward. When asked whether there would be consequences from the company or any self-imposed punishment, White dismissed the notion.
Are there any repercussions planned from the company or self-imposed repercussions?
Yeah, well, I mean, what should the repercussions be? You tell me. I take 30 days off. How does that hurt me? I mean, I told you guys when we were going through COVID could last 10 years. I could sit it out and, you know what I mean? What would be the problem? It's much like COVID, actually. You know, me leaving hurts the company, hurts my employees, hurts the fighters. Doesn't hurt me. I could have left in 2016.
That statement, "I could have left in 2016, carries different meaning now, because according to his court testimony, in many ways, he did leave, not officially or publicly, but functionally. The core responsibilities of operating the UFC departed his control around that time frame. By December 2025, White had signed a 5-year contract extension, securing his position through at least 2031. He has stated publicly and repeatedly that he will never retire. However, the question is no longer whether Dana White will remain at the UFC, but what staying actually means when someone else handles the work. Helwani captured this point when acknowledging that while White has stepped back from frontline duties, the world surrounding the UFC has expanded dramatically.
By that, he's still involved in the top line stuff, but there are a ton of other people involved now. It used to be a very small team. There's the whole TKO team, there's the whole Endeavor team, and obviously there's people like Hunter Campbell there.
White is no longer immersed in UFC operations, but positioned above them, distributed across a portfolio, including boxing, technology, and slap fighting. The lawsuits that placed him on that witness stand are about to test whether the corporate structure he now operates within was designed to serve fighters or suppress them. Dana White didn't volunteer this information about his role. He provided it under oath because fighters sued the UFC and a federal judge compelled him to answer questions. The antitrust lawsuits that brought White into that courtroom have been developing for over a decade and represent the most serious legal challenge the promotion has ever confronted. The story begins in December 2014 when former fighters including Kung Le, John Fitch, Nathan Quarry, Brandon Vera, and others filed a class-action antitrust lawsuit against Zuffa LLC. The complaint accused the UFC of violating Sections 1 and 2 of the Sherman Antitrust Act through a deliberate scheme to suppress fighter compensation and eliminate competition. They alleged the UFC controlled over 90% of the market for elite professional MMA fighter services and that fighters captured only 15 to 20% of event revenues compared to roughly 50% in comparable sports like boxing or major American leagues. That case, Lee versus Zuffa, covered bouts from December 2010 to June 2017, taking over a decade to resolve. In August 2024, Judge Boulware granted class certification for approximately In early 2025, the UFC agreed to a $37.5 million settlement, one of sports antitrust history's largest. Payments went to eligible fighters based on bout frequency, earnings, and career impact, with some receiving seven figures while others received tens of thousands. Dana White addressed the lawsuit publicly, comparing the situation to pay evolution in other sports.
You know, if you look at some of these guys that are in this thing, some of them are when we were in the hole, however much money. And it's like the early days of baseball. Like the money that's being made now is much more than the money that was made then, 10 years from now. And you can't control how people are going to spend their money. It happens in the NBA, it happens in the NFL, it happens in Major League Baseball.
But that $37.5 million settlement included a crucial limitation. It provided only monetary relief, with no injunctive provisions, mandating changes to the UFC's business practices. This is precisely why two additional lawsuits remain active as of February. Johnson versus Zuffa, filed in 2021 by C.J. Johnson and others, extends the class period from July 2017 onward. Serkinov versus Zuffa, led by former light heavyweight Misha Serkinov, makes overlapping allegations about continued anti-competitive conduct. The Johnson case seeks something the first lawsuit didn't: permanent injunctive relief. This means fighters aren't just requesting money this time, they're asking a federal court to force the UFC to modify how it structures contracts and conducts business. The stakes are fundamentally different. Fighters who received payments from the first settlement expressed gratitude, even if they remained cautious about public statements. Helwani discussed this dynamic on his show.
I have heard from fighters who have gotten their payments and they're happy with it. So this is a gift. This is something that a lot of fighters who are maybe struggling or who are hoping to get a little extra cash now on the back end of their career, post-fighting, this is something they're very thankful for and very excited about. Even though they may not say it, and even though some of them may be a little trepidatious, they are all very, very happy about the payments.
The February 2026 spoliation hearing was part of these ongoing cases, with plaintiffs alleging that the UFC and its executives failed to preserve substantial volumes of text messages, emails, and other communications, particularly those involving key decision-makers, despite litigation holds in place since at least 2014. Judge Boulware noted inconsistencies in evidence production and signaled that possible sanctions could include adverse inference instructions, allowing jurors to presume any missing evidence would have been unfavorable to the UFC. If that ruling materializes, it could shift the entire litigation in the fighter's favor. White's admission about his diminished role only reinforces the fighter's argument. If the CEO has zero involvement in contracts or matchmaking, then the system operates independently. a corporate machine maintaining market dominance without any individual being directly accountable for fighter compensation. Helwani noted that the previous settlement covered through 2016 and 2017, but years of conduct remain to be litigated.
So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. The previous class action lawsuit covered up until 2016, 2017. And so there's still a lot more years to come. And I know that there are a lot of fighters banking on that.
The personal controversies White has encountered over the years haven't improved his public image as these lawsuits advance. The New Year's Eve 2023 altercation with his wife Anne, captured on video at a Cabo San Lucas nightclub, drew widespread criticism. White addressed it at a press conference before UFC events in January 2023, accepting full responsibility and refusing to let anyone defend him.
These guys have trained hard and got ready for this fight. What happened on New Year's Eve is my mistake, not theirs. And obviously, nobody's more about free speech than me. If somebody, if one of the fighters wants to come out and voice their opinion on it and whatever it might be, then by all means. I'm sure you guys have seen the TMZ video and seen my interview. It was obviously a horrible personal experience, and there's no excuses for it.
No formal punishment was imposed by Endeavor or ESPN, and White continued in his position. The incident, along with a 2015 sex tape extortion case, resolved through the courts by October 2020, represents periods of personal turmoil that contrast with the image White projects as the UFC's face. Neither incident resulted in lasting professional consequences, but they provide context for a man whose public persona and private reality have increasingly diverged. While the lawsuits progress and personal controversies accumulate, the UFC has been managing yet another crisis that strikes at the fight's credibility themselves. As Dana White was in court discussing his role in deleted text messages, the UFC was confronting a separate problem threatening the sport's legitimacy. Starting in mid-2025 and escalating into early 2026, a series of betting integrity crises hit the promotion, including suspicious betting patterns, last-minute fight cancellations, fighter releases, and an ongoing FBI investigation. These problems emerged as the UFC's partnerships with sports betting platforms like DraftKings and FanDuel generated significant revenue while creating new vulnerabilities. The most prominent incident involved bantamweights Christian Delgarian and Wandel Valle, scheduled to fight at UFC 324 on December 4. Hours before the event, unusual betting shifts were detected with heavy money on Del Valle as an underdog, prompting the UFC's integrity team to pull the fight. The Nevada State Athletic Commission flagged the irregularities. An FBI probe launched in January 2026, focused on whether fighters or their camps had leaked confidential information to influence odds. Delgarian was released, Del Valle was suspended. Multiple fights were pulled across other cards at UFC 320 in October 2025 and UFC 327 in January 20. White spoke to TMZ about the situation, saying the UFC approached the fighter before the bout, asked direct questions, received assurances that nothing was wrong, then the fight unfolded in a way that appeared suspicious.
There's no proof that he's done this yet, but I can tell you this, it doesn't look good. It definitely doesn't look good. We approached him before the fight. He and his lawyer, and they denied that anything, from everything. Are you hurt? Are you injured in any way? Do you owe people money? Have you been asked to do anything, illegal? We asked them all the questions, and everything was absolutely not, hell no. So the fight went on. And then, like I said, fight ended by finish in the first round, literally walked out from the octagon into my room in the back and called the FBI.
Helwani's panel discussed the story and agreed that the UFC itself isn't behind any of this, as the logic doesn't support it. Why would a promotion risk everything it's built for a few fixed fights? One panelist stated, that's the best point.
Consider the logic, right? We're talking about gambling. What kind of gamble would it be to risk $7.7 billion in rights fees on a few $1 million? Like, it just does not make sense. You'd have to be absolutely insane. You'd have to be self-sabotaging to be involved in this from a UFC.
However, the panel also made a point about accountability. The UFC benefits from being synonymous with MMA, meaning when problems hit the sport, they impact the UFC's brand most severely.
The UFC benefits a great deal from being the primary fight provider of all of MMA, right? They benefit greatly from how many people they have on the roster, for how many fights they do, for how much activity they do. And there's a lot, oftentimes, that people say, instead of MMA, say the UFC. This is the downside. When things go shitty, this is what happens as well, right? This is the other edge of that sword, which is you benefit greatly from MMA being equal to UFC in most people's eyes.
This gambling crisis unfolds against the backdrop of the biggest business deal in UFC history. On August 11th, 2025, TKO Group Holdings announced a 7-year, $7.7 billion media rights agreement with Paramount. The deal eliminates pay-per-view entirely in the U.S. market. Starting in 2026, every UFC event, all 13 numbered cards and all 30 fight nights becomes available on Paramount Plus at no additional cost beyond a standard subscription. Select events also simulcast on CBS. The deal was expanded in October 2025 to cover Latin America and Australia for the same 7-year term, doubling the annual revenue from the previous ESPN partnership. Joe Rogan discussed how the deal would transform the sport, saying every single event being available for the price of a streaming subscription would blow the doors open.
There's going to be no more pay-per-views. All the events are going to be available for everybody for free. Every pay-per-view, every fight card that they have from the Apex, which are my favorite.
Yeah.
Everything is going to be available for free. It's an amazing deal.
Rogan's co-host agreed and highlighted how the economics favor fans, noting that 2 pay-per-views used to cost more than an entire year of Paramount Plus, but now every fight is included.
$10. So if it's let's say it's $10, that's crazy. That's $120 a year. You could watch every UFC pay-per-view. 2 UFC pay-per-views is like $140, right?
Yeah.
Isn't it? Aren't they like $70?
$70? Yeah.
So you get all of them. Everything's free. That's incredible.
So here's where things stand. Dana White's name remains on the door. His title is still CEO, but his hands aren't on the wheel, and by his own words under oath, they haven't been for years. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, click on one of the boxes appearing on your screen to watch more similar content.